Welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. I'm John, Father John Deere, and today I would like to reflect with you on our beloved Pope Francis, who died on Easter Monday. This podcast is a project of beatitudecenter.org, where you can find many other podcasts and Zoom programs on the nonviolence of Jesus, practicing nonviolence, and working for a more just, more nonviolent world. So let's begin with a little prayer. So I invite you, wherever you are, just to take a deep breath and to relax. Notice how you're feeling and recenter yourself. And I invite you to enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves you infinitely and personally and everyone. And let's welcome the risen nonviolent Jesus here with us and ask for the grace to follow the nonviolent Jesus ever more faithfully and to do God's will. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life, love, and resurrection peace that you give us. Thank you for the extraordinary life, witness, teaching, and example of Pope Francis. Be with us now as we reflect together on his life and witness. Bless us, inspire us, disarm us, strengthen us, renew us in hope, and send us out to do your will that we might carry on and, like him, proclaim your way of love and peace and nonviolence, that like him we might do our part to end poverty, racism, corporate greed, injustice, war, environmental destruction, and the whole culture of violence, that like him we might be your holy beatitude people of universal love, compassion, and peace, your holy peacemakers. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, a few years ago, 3 French peace activists went and met with Pope Francis, and they asked him for advice. And you know what he said? Immediately, start a revolution. Go shake things up. The world is deaf. You have to open its ears. That's what Pope Francis did. He started a nonviolent revolution, and he invited all of us to join in. I think Pope Francis was the most radical, most progressive, most nonviolent, most prophetic, most peace activist-oriented pope in history, and therefore the greatest pope in history, hands down. And I give thanks to God for Francis for many reasons, but mainly because he did such a great job, because he spoke out so boldly, so prophetically, in word and deed for justice, the poor, disarmament, peace, creation, mercy, nonviolence, and the nonviolent Jesus, and that we had him for 12 years, and that he didn't resign and retire, but he kept at it till his last day, Easter Sunday. And I give thanks that we all got to live during his time. I think he's one of our greatest saints, right up there with Francis of Assisi, Dorothy Day, and Oscar Romero. And I hope he will also be named a doctor of the church. Well, we've been hearing since he died how he was the first non-European pope in centuries, the first Jesuit pope, the first Latino, the first pope from Latin America, the first pope trained after Vatican II, the first pope who was not a Vatican insider, the first to take the name of St. Francis, which was a bold and daring thing to do. I like the fact that he was the first pope who worked as a bouncer at a pub before he entered the seminary. But I think Pope Francis lived and proclaimed the Beatitudes. And I wrote him and told him that. I wrote him a lot, and he sent me encouraging messages. He said he liked all my books on Jesus, peace, and nonviolence. And when I started this Beatitude Center, he sent me a message about how much he liked it and all this work to promote the nonviolent Jesus. I also asked him for many things, and repeatedly for 10 years for an encyclical on Jesus and nonviolence. Once I asked him to call for a new Vatican III on Jesus and nonviolence. I think last year I wrote him and asked him to declare a holy year on the Beatitudes or peacemaking. When I was at the Vatican in December 2022, I gave Cardinal Czerny, who's a Jesuit and a friend and the number 2 to Pope Francis, a letter in Spanish, which he put in Francis's hands. And I asked Francis to write a foreword to my latest book, The Gospel of Peace, a commentary on the Gospels from the perspective of nonviolence. And then I said in the letter, Well, while I'm at it, let's write a book together. I'll come over and spend the summer with you. And I called it The Things That Make for Peace, and I drafted an outline for it. And then I said, and while I'm at it, how about giving me a job? How about inviting me to Rome, and let's open the Vatican Office of Nonviolence to promote gospel nonviolence full-time around the world? And Cardinal Czerny sent me an email later that day saying the Pope read it and said, kind of shaking his head, "Tell John, dear, I'm way too busy to do all that," which I thought was kind of funny. I was just about to invite him to be a guest on this podcast, the Nonviolent Jesus podcast, when he got sick. I had every intention to do that because I knew he made phone calls. Francis had a universal perspective and looked at the whole human race and all of creation all the time. We Americans, together as a people, don't do that. I think we're very self-centered, egotistic. We practice a kind of collective narcissism. But Francis, now this is so important, was looking at everyone, every human being, all creation, all the time, the whole world, through the eyes of the nonviolent Jesus. And that's why he spoke boldly about universal love, universal compassion, universal justice, and universal peace, because he had a universal vision. And I think that's the spiritual life. That's the politics of the nonviolent Jesus. That's the direction we all need to move in. And it leads to universal nonviolence. I think every one of us is called by Jesus to be empowered like that, to have a universal perspective, and therefore to practice and promote universal love, compassion, and peace. So what I'd like to do is reflect on a few of his great themes leading up to, for me, the great themes of peacemaking and nonviolence. So first, his commitment to the poor. Remember, he began his papacy that first day saying he envisioned a church that is poor and for the poor. It's remarkable. Yes, do charity work, he said, and serve the poor and marginalized. But here is the key. Have real relationships with real poor, marginalized, and disenfranchised people. Get involved in their lives personally, and then join their struggle to end injustice and end systemic violence and poverty, and do it through the love for them, for actual suffering people. I love that he opened a homeless shelter in the Vatican, that he visited prisoners regularly, and that he spoke out passionately about and met with migrants and refugees. Next, of course, is his commitment to Mother Earth. He wrote many great books and great encyclicals like Fratelli Tutti, where he called for a global fraternity rooted in love, solidarity, and respect for all people, where everyone moves beyond divisions and tries to work together to build a more just, compassionate world. But his encyclical on the environment, Laudate Si, is one of the greatest documents in history. Not only does he denounce our destruction of the planet and the creatures, but he denounces capitalism, corporate greed, and war as root causes of climate change. The earth, he says, is, quote, beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. He called climate change, quote, a moral crisis, and denounced what he called, quote, an economy that kills. It was very important. A system, he said, that discards both people and creation in pursuit of profit. So he denounced what he called our throwaway culture as a moral failure. See, no wonder so many people are against him. And he named indifference as one of the greatest threats to our future. He insisted that, quote, we can no longer turn our backs on reality, what's happening in the world, war, climate change, and the harm and injustice toward the poor. And he called everyone to take action for justice, compassion, and Mother Earth, which he called over and over again our common home. Third, his commitment to mercy. Mercy, mercy, mercy. Over and over again, he called us to show mercy, to grant general clemency, to let go of all grudges and forgive everyone, and put down our swords, our guns, our weapons, and reconcile and seek peace. But in particular, He changed the fine print of canon law so there's not one sentence of support for the death penalty. No Catholic, he would say, no Christian can support the death penalty. Of course, Jesus was first of all a victim of capital punishment. So he tried many times personally to intervene and stop impending executions, for which I'm so grateful. Fourth, his commitment to diversity, equality, and inclusion. Hello. Which started early on when the reporter on the plane asked him about LGBT folks, and he said, "Who am I to judge?" which shocked the whole world. And that's precisely why the right hates him so much, because unlike Trump and so many others, he refused to scapegoat people or to judge anyone, which, by the way, is one of the commandments in the Sermon on the Mount. But, however, he did judge and vehemently condemned corporate greed, hatred, prejudice, racism, war, bombings, genocide, nuclear weapons, and really the whole U.S. itself because of its imperial domination. Fifth, his commitment to reform the church, especially through the synod. If you follow his process, which he gave his heart to these last few years, which has the potential to transform the global Catholic Church and make it more egalitarian with a real bottom-up decision-making process. If priests are to be good shepherds like Jesus, then he said, they need to, quote, smell like sheep, smell like the sheep. Quote, he said, the church is like a field hospital after battle. That's a powerful sentence, which he said early on. It's the place where people go for healing, recovery, and comfort. So it's going to be messy and stressful because it serves the suffering. All of that, of course, is about the opposite of the way it is here in the first world. Could he have done more? Of course he could have. I wish he had ordained women as deacons, for starters, and said that priests could marry. I wish he had placed women as the head of many, if not all, decision-making bodies within the Curia and the Church. As Joan Chittister wrote this week, my friend who was recently on our podcast, quote, he failed women. I wish he had made a much stronger response to the horrific sex abuse scandal. But I liked that he tried vigorously to get bishops and priests not to run around like aristocrats, but to let go of power and pride and be of humble service to all people. He kept saying, todos, todos, todos. Everyone, everyone, everyone. Well, now we're getting to where, for me, it's the heart of it. His great commitment to peace and peacemaking and eventually nonviolence. Everything Francis did, I think, was a form of gospel peacemaking. Like Gandhi, Dorothy Day, Dr. King, and St. Francis, Pope Francis was against all war. All wars, no matter what the reason, and that's the leap very few people make. Not just bishops and priests, by the way, but people around the world. Few people make that total leap, which is what Jesus calls us to. One of his last books, for example, which I highly recommend, which hardly anybody in the U.S. knows about, is called simply Against War. It's a whole book about why we can't be involved in war. And if you study carefully the response to his death, the tributes in the mainstream press, I think you will notice that very few mention his consistent stand against war, his total opposition to nuclear weapons, his efforts to end all the wars in Africa, and in particular the Russian war on Ukraine. That's amazing to me. And, when Russia invaded Ukraine, he broke all protocol, much to the shock of the Curia, and immediately went across town to the Russian embassy and begged for an end to the war. Now, that's what the Pope should do. But most of all, he denounced the horrific Hamas attack and kidnappings, and from then on, every day denounced U.S.-backed Israeli genocide in Gaza, which has killed over 51,000 people as of today. And then nearly every night since the war began, at 7 o'clock, he called the one Catholic church in Gaza, right up through Holy Saturday, to see how they were holding up. His last public words on Easter Sunday were a call for a lasting ceasefire in Gaza. Wow, what a challenge. I hope all of us can try to speak out publicly until the day we die, calling for an end to all war, all nuclear weapons, the wars in Ukraine and Africa, and the Israeli genocide in Gaza. What a gift he was. Francis went to many places around the world, but places that few people visit and no popes had visited. And he was trying to fulfill Jesus' commandment to make peace and practice the universal compassionate love of God. So Francis went to Iraq, something I tried to get John Paul to do and later Benedict. He went to Myanmar, North Macedonia, Bahrain, Mongolia, the Congo, South Korea, and Morocco. When he was in Palestine, wow, he drove by the wall, made them stop the car, got out, went up to the evil Israeli wall of occupation, put his hand on it, and prayed there, just as he had done a few days before at the Wailing Wall. In the United Arab Emirates, he had a historic and fruitful meeting with the Muslim leaders. In Canada, he apologized for the church's treatment of indigenous people over the centuries, and finally tore up the doctrine of discovery. Remember the statement from 1493? The papal bulls that said, okay, any Christian emperor or king can go and invade the New World and take any land for the indigenous people for Christ and kill them, whatever you have to do. That only ended 2 years ago. In Greece, he made a surprise visit to a refugee camp and then brought 3 Muslim families back on the plane to Rome with him. In the Central African Republic, he went right into the war zone. I'm not kidding you. It's a miracle he wasn't killed. He literally placed himself in harm's way, just as you kind of wish the Pope had done. Of course, it's got no publicity in the West. In Hiroshima, he denounced all nuclear weapons and said that the mere possession of them and the threat to use them as a deterrent was immoral. And he begged the world's leaders to abolish all nuclear weapons. Now, I know this sounds obvious to us now, but that's not what John Paul had said. He said, yeah, we're against them, but, if you really need to nuke the world, you can do that for Jesus. That's always been what the leaders of the world have said. Francis has changed all of that. I never thought I'd live to see all of this. No Catholic, and therefore for him, no Christian can build, work with, support, threaten, or profit from nuclear weapons, he said. But perhaps the most dramatic peacemaking act he did was in April 2019, which you can watch online. There's videos of it. Wow, when he brought the president of South Sudan and the rebel leaders together at the Vatican for a 2-day retreat. They're in the middle of the war. And at the end, they're being filmed. It's like in a living room. He pleads for negotiations, urges them to end the killing and to stay on track for peace. And then he goes around the room, and the poor old guy got down on his knees and begged each one of them, the arch enemies killing each other, directly for peace. And he kissed each person's feet in the room. That's way beyond St. Francis and Gandhi and Martin Luther King. We've never had such a symbolic peacemaking act in history, I propose. Of course, that was so ignored here in the West that he was doing things like that. And I know because of my contacts in South Sudan that inspired many people to start using the word nonviolence and building a grassroots movement of nonviolence. I was personally inspired that he spent 2 hours every morning, every single day in prayer and meditation from 4 a.m. to 6 a.m., just as Gandhi spent 2 hours in meditation every single day. And by the way, both of them were very busy people. So it's a challenge to all of us. I really liked his address to Congress when he urged us to follow what he said were the 4 greatest Americans. Okay, Abraham Lincoln for abolishing slavery. Right. I was expecting him to say George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and FDR. And he goes, Martin Luther King Jr., Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton. Wow. I had celebrated Mass with him and many other priests at Catholic University the day before. And he seemed to me like a very sweet, gentle, old parish priest. But that day in Congress, he stood up like a mighty prophet. I liked all his harsh critiques of President Trump and the many U.S. Catholic bishops and priests who support Trump and the Republican Party. I liked that the weekend he died, he had a cardinal read a long statement on the fundamentals of compassion and welcoming immigrants to J.D. Vance. I liked that he fired everyone at the Vatican bank. People don't realize that. He excommunicated the Italian mafia. I didn't know that till I first went to Rome. I mean, I was always amazed he was not assassinated. I liked that he jailed the cardinal who stole millions from the Vatican Fund for the Poor and had a really posh penthouse apartment in Rome. He put the guy in the old Vatican jail. I don't even know if I would have done that, but it was amazing. I was impressed how he consistently met with leaders of popular grassroots movements from the global South regularly. Of course, that was ignored too, and he encouraged them in all grassroots movements. And because I was going regularly to the Vatican, I noticed that he did not do that with movement leaders here in the United States. And then it dawned on me, that's precisely the point. He's from the global South, so he's determined to listen to their voices, not ours, from the rich, wealthy global North. I have been working over the years for the release of the indigenous leader, American Indian Leonard Peltier, who spent 49 years in prison. And I know that the Pope called President Biden last December and made a personal appeal to release Leonard. And that, along with the campaign, is why Leonard Peltier was released from prison on the day Trump was inaugurated. Once, when I was visiting Julian Assange, you remember he was in exile in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, which is something I did periodically, and we became friends. I got there and Julian said, you wouldn't believe it, but yesterday Pope Francis called him out of the blue, and they talked for an hour, and it really helped him. I remember the Pope never told the world that he did that, and so Julian never did, and I never said anything either. And I really liked that. That was Francis being a pastor to Julian. In the end, for me, though, it was his commitment to active, creative, daring nonviolence that gives me the most hope. Francis learned, as we all have to learn, that the only way forward, really our only hope, is if every human being tries to practice, teach, and promote the total nonviolence of Jesus and work together for what Francis called a new culture of nonviolence. So as some listeners may know, my friends and I went to the Vatican many times over the years asking for an encyclical on Jesus and nonviolence, to make this the official teaching, position, and law of the Church. We wanted a statement as great as Laudato Si. And while Francis was doing so much for peace, he wrote and changed laws around Laudato Si and the earth and care for the poor and mercy, like St. Francis. But he didn't change the canon law. And that's what we were going for, to make this the new path of the Church. We never got what we were looking for. But wow, did he do a lot to turn the Church back to its roots in gospel nonviolence. So all this led up to April 2016, when he welcomed the first ever conference on nonviolence at the Vatican, which was organized by Marie Dennis, who was on this podcast recently, and Pax Christi International. And it was one of the greatest experiences of all of our lives. And at the end, we issued a joint statement between Pax Christi and the members of the conference and the Vatican, saying there is no such thing as a just war, and calling everyone to practice nonviolence. Well, as far as I can tell, that had never been said before. So, just a brief timeline. The first 3 centuries of the Church practiced radical nonviolence. That's what Jesus did and commanded. But then in 315, the emperor legalized Christianity, said you can all join the army, threw out the Sermon on the Mount, turned to the Cicero, the pagan, and they began the just war theory to justify warfare. And here we are today. We're trying to change that. Francis started the process. And it was there at the conference that Cardinal Peter Turkson asked me to draft the Pope's next World Day of Peace message. The Pope always issues a statement on peace every January 1st. And it came out January 1st, 2017, called Nonviolence, a Style of Politics for Peace. And if you haven't read it, please go look it up. I call it the first ever statement on nonviolence in the history of the church since the Sermon on the Mount. So he says, to be true followers of Jesus today includes embracing his teachings on nonviolence. In the most local and ordinary situations and in the international order, may nonviolence become the hallmark of all our decisions, our relationships, and our actions, and indeed of all political life in all its forms. That's everything we would want the Pope to say. From now on, folks, we have to be people of total nonviolence, like Jesus. And he ends by saying, may we make active nonviolence our way of life. And I pledge the assistance of the Church in every effort to build peace through active and creative nonviolence. And he did. And we saw, because we kept going back, and Marie and our friends continue to go back, we saw certainly the Curia change. The Vatican has changed completely on the questions of peace and justice and nonviolence since we started going there. It's a noticeable change, thanks to Marie Dennis's great leadership. And then through the years, he continued to speak about nonviolence. Here's some quotes. I think of nonviolence as a perspective and a way of understanding the world, to which theology must look as one of its constitutive elements. Nonviolence, he said, is a universal value that finds fulfillment in the gospel of Christ. Wow, that's perfect. He called for like a new nonviolent lifestyle, that we all live new lives of nonviolence. And he said, quote, it's not the same as weakness or passivity. That means it presupposes firmness, courage, and the ability to face issues and conflicts with intellectual honesty and truly seeking the common ground. And he writes, we have seen outstanding examples of how nonviolence, embraced with conviction and practiced consistently, can yield significant results, even on the social and political plane. Some people, indeed entire nations, thanks to the efforts of nonviolent leaders, peacefully achieve the goals of freedom and justice, through nonviolence. This is the path to pursue now and in the future. This is the path of peace. In 2019, I remember he gave a talk to the Anti-Defamation League, and he said, faced with so much violence spreading throughout the world, we are called to a greater nonviolence. Wow. That's really speaks to me. I think that's a challenge. We have to go beyond Gandhi and Dr. King and really pursue nonviolence in much greater ways than we ever have before. And elsewhere he writes, let us remember that even in cases of self-defense, peace is the ultimate goal, and that a lasting peace can exist only without weapons. So let's make nonviolence our guide for all our actions, both in daily life and in international relations. And let us pray for a more widespread culture of nonviolence. Wow. That will progress when countries and citizens alike resort less and less to the use of arms. In his last statement on Easter Sunday, if you may have seen, he prayed for an end to all violence everywhere. Dear friends, I think that was his prayer, his message, his hope, his faith, his life. And I say that too because of my own experience getting challenged and objected to by so many bishops and priests. But, I found this quote I put in my book as the frontispiece, Praise Be Peace, where Francis says, God's name is peace. That's very profound theology. And if that's true, and I believe it is, then no wonder he works so hard for peace. Well, I keep pondering since he died what he said on 60 Minutes, which you can go watch on YouTube, which was very provocative and a total challenge to us Americans. I think it was actually kind of in your face because it's addressed to us. Here's the quote. I typed it out. There are so many Pontius Pilates on the loose out there running around. You all see what is happening, all these wars, the injustices, the crimes, and then you shrug and say, that's okay, and then you wash your hands. That's indifference. That is what happens when the heart hardens. Please, we have to get our hearts to feel again. We cannot remain indifferent in the face of such human dramas. The globalization of indifference is a very ugly disease. That's a very profound challenge to people here in the first world, us comfortable people. The globalization of indifference. You know, when Dan Berrigan was kicked out of the United States because of his opposition to the Vietnam War and was in Latin America, and I'm sure he knew Pope Francis, he wrote that famously. The opposite of love is not hate. It's indifference. It's indifference. And that's what Francis is seeing, and he's challenging everybody. Wake up. That's why he said to those 3 French activists, start a revolution. Shout nonviolently. Wake people up. So what do we do? What's a good way to honor him? I think a good way to honor and remember Pope Francis's peacemaking life and his death at Easter is to renounce our indifference and to rise to the occasion as he did, and to claim our power as public peacemakers. And so, more than ever, to step out into the culture in this terrible moment we're going through, to speak out, march in the streets, take public action, and resist all violence. War, injustice, poverty, racism, corporate greed, fascism, authoritarianism, white supremacy, the U.S.-backed Israeli genocide in Gaza, nuclear weapons, and environmental destruction. He called this year a Jubilee year of hope, and he called us to be, quote, pilgrims of hope. So I invite us in his Easter spirit to rise up, to rise and shine, reclaim gospel nonviolence as he tried to do, as he was beginning to do, and to see the world through the eyes of the nonviolent Jesus as he did, and to do what we can publicly as gospel peacemakers to welcome God's reign of peace on earth. Amen. Thank you so much, dear friends, for listening to this Nonviolent Jesus podcast. You can hear many other podcasts and find other great Zoom programs at beatitudecenter.org. And please consider offering a donation to support this free work. If you can, please leave some positive feedback or review on NCR or Apple or Spotify or whatever platform you use. And please tell your friends and church groups about this podcast to help promote it. Thanks. May the God of peace bless us all. Keep on following the risen, nonviolent Jesus. See you all next time. Thanks so much.